It is a huge pleasure to welcome a kindred spirit who I just met in person last night, a shining star. Not a great resource, because resources we extract. You're a shining star, you're going big. Inordinate fondness for puns, I'm learning. And Kate, who's out there somewhere, is probably going to enjoy some of the puns that are here, the title of this Nemminar's talk. So this talk is part of our Nemmers Seminar series. That also includes a discussion session that is organized by Maggie Osborne. But today we are going to benefit from learning and sharing some time from Allison Karp, who, interestingly enough, is not originally a geologist or earth scientist and came in a little bit sideways, like many of us have, originally as a biologist in this particular case, environmental science, and has graduated from WashU. Ecology and evolution and environmental sciences, environmental earth sciences with Alex Bradley, and went on to do a PhD at Penn State with Kate. But in between that, had also some great fun in the summer working with David Fike, doing lab work, and that was, you stuck to it and have really bloomed forward. Most recently, Allison is at Yale in a postdoc position. And please join me in congratulating Allison and just being awarded an NSF EAR. So congratulations. And we look forward to learning from you today about all sorts of things. Molecular approaches, shed light, I think that's the pun, right? Yeah. Okay. On wildfire dynamics in ancient grasslands.
Well, thank you so much, Trish, for that really wonderful introduction. And I just wanted to thank you for inviting me to speak at this venue. It's really an honor to talk at a venue that's really an honor of Kate and Kate's work, who's my PhD advisor and a close mentor and friend. So I'm excited to share with you, actually, half of this talk is work that we collaborated on during my PhD, and the second half is some work that I've been doing during my postdoc. So with that, I'll take it away and start by talking a little bit about why we care about fire in subtropical grasslands. So these systems are actually responsible for the majority of the world's fires. In the news, we hear a lot about wildfires in California and the Amazon, places that are forests burning. But in fact, 71% of annual global burn area comes from these subtropical grassland systems that burn very, very frequently. And so if we want to understand the role that fire has to play in the Earth system and the carbon cycle, it's absolutely critical to zoom in on these grassland systems. And this really comes out when you break down carbon sources and sinks that fire is responsible for. So subtropical systems actually are responsible for 60% of annual global fire emissions, so much more than forest burning actually contributes to. And they produce 49% of pyrogenic carbon, which is carbon that's basically aromatized during combustion and pyrolysis processes and then stored in soils, and that's ultimately a carbon sink. So when we're balancing carbon fluxes in terms of fire and the carbon cycle, grasslands are really important to understand. We still have a lot of work to do in that pursuit. Fire is also really important to the ecology of these systems. It's absolutely essential for maintaining the openness in these systems via the series of interconnected positive feedbacks. So fire keeps these open spaces open. It prevents trees from growing up and shading out these grassland systems. And then the grasses themselves are very flammable, so they create this high fire system. So if you are able to exclude fire in any way, you can have trees encroach in your grassy system. They create a much higher moisture environment, and that can actually exclude fire. So there are these two, positive feedbacks that really maintain a stable forest or stable savanna state in seasonal systems today. And these subtropical grassland systems are really dominated by C4 grasses, or grasses that use the C4 photosynthetic pathway, which has both structural and enzymatic differences that allow these plants to do very well in low CO2, arid, high temperature growing conditions that characterize a lot of these subtropical systems. And just for perspective, here are some pictures of what a C3 and a C4 grassland look like, and you can see they're functionally really different too. So the one in orange is a spinifex savanna in Australia, and the C3 prairie is actually from Bannockburn up on the North Shore, right outside where I went to high school. So you can see that there are there's functional differences as well. And there's isotopic differences. So these pathways in part really different isotope effects on the material that's produced from these particular groups of plants. So the C3 pathway actually has much more selectivity for the lighter carbon isotope, which results in material that's fixed by plants using this pathway having relatively negative carbon isotope values, while material that is fixed using the C4 pathway has relatively positive values. This is about a 10 to 12 per mole difference. And this split means that using these isotopes as a proxy to characterize systems that either were dominated by C3 or C4 plants is really useful. And it's one that's commonly used. And I know that other speakers who've spoken at this venue have probably talked quite extensively about. And we know that grasslands, C4 grasslands, or systems that are dominated by grasses that use this pathway expanded globally in the late Miocene into the Pliocene between about 10 to 3 million years ago. The evolutionary origination of this pathway was much earlier, but the ecological expansion took place during this period. And it's been a longstanding question, why do these systems actually expanded? There have been a lot of different factors that have been proposed. And we're kind of zooming in on it's likely some combination of all of these things together, but some different proposed expansion factors have been a drop in CO2, so low CO2 selecting for the C4 pathway, aridity, nutrient loss or shifts in nutrients, and the final one is more local factors or disturbance by either animals or fire. And I'm sure it's no surprise that I'm really going to be zooming in on the fire variable today and talking a little bit more about that. So I'm going to present work from 2 little vignettes about fire and grasslands. The first is going to be addressing the expansion of grasslands in the Neogene and the role of fire in that initial expansion. But then I'm also going to be talking a bit about fire in already established grasslands during the African human period and the Holocene. So kind of switching timescales a little bit, but talking about how fire might respond to climate shifts in grasslands that are already established. And the tools that I mainly use to get at these questions are organic geochemical tools. So biomarkers, both plant biomarkers and fire biomarkers. So I use the commonly used leaf waxes, which are these long chain structures that are produced on the surface of leaves. They're basically ubiquitous in sedimentary records, and they retain both distribution and isotopic information about plants and the environment those plants are growing in. So they're really useful as a proxy for getting at vegetation and also hydrologic shifts. The other group of compounds that I'm going to be using, and that a lot of my work has oriented around, is thinking about PAHs, or polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, which are these aromatic ring structures that are produced through the combustion of biomass, and you can use to tell you something about vegetation burning in the past. This is, there we go. So PAHs are a suite of different aromatic compounds with different sizes. They're, as I mentioned, derived from biomass combustion. They're relatively recalcitrant and stable on long timescales because of these aromatic rings. They're really useful potentially in other records where you use another molecular paleoenvironmental proxy to get an environment, because they're going to have a more similar taphonomy to something like a leaf wax than something like a pollen grain, right? So if you're looking at charcoal and leaf waxes, there's potentially taphonomic differences of how those 2 records are coming into your archive, while PAHs are going to be closer in their preservation potential to leaf waxes. And then finally, I just want to point out that there's a lot of discussion about the biases in the charcoal proxy, and one thing that's been found is that some of the higher size fractions of charcoal may potentially be biased against grassy fires. And so PAHs have the potential to maybe overcome some of these issues with using charcoal as a proxy in grassy systems. However, there are challenges associated with PAHs as a geochemical proxy for fire as well. They're found in relatively low concentrations to other types of molecules that we find in these records, such as GBGTs or leaf waxes. They're somewhat analytically challenging to measure, but these are both issues that we can overcome with laboratory techniques. I'm going to be kind of focusing in on some of these other issues that affect our ability to use them as a paleo fire proxy. So the first is there's potential for mixed sources. There's unknowns in what signals are actually recorded in the compound-specific carbon isotope values of these compounds. And then there's uncertainty on what controls the primary distribution of these different sizes of PAHs. So I'm going to be addressing these challenges as I talk through these two different case studies and giving you examples of ways we've come up with to overcome them and better interpret them as a paleofire proxy. So I'm going to move to the first section of the talk, really digging into the question of, did fires facilitate the expansion of open grassland systems in Eugene? So the idea that fire was potentially essential to this expansion process is not a new one. It was first proposed by John Keeley and Phil Rundle in the early 2000s, mostly based on observations and modeling from modern grassland systems about these feedbacks that maintain these systems. So they basically propose that if you have a shift in hydrology, increasing the hydrologic variability or the seasonality in your system, you have the ability to build up a lot of fuel during the wet growing season and then dry it out and cure it during the dry season, which would have increased the propensity for annual frequent fires, potentially clearing away trees and allowing grasses that have been previously shaded to expand. Then once you have grasses on the landscape, these grow very quickly and cure better than woody fuels. And so these grasses might have themselves maintain these frequently burning open systems. So there's two parts of this feedback, the initial expansion and then this maintenance of the open state. As I said, this hypothesis has been around for a long time, but there's been fairly scant empirical evidence to support it. And so we were really interested in asking, and one of the main exploration questions I explored during my time working with Kate was, does proxy evidence support fire feedbacks facilitating the Neogene C4 grassland expansion? So to get at this question, I returned to a really classic area, one of the first regions where C4 grassland expansion was originally recorded in the carbon isotopes of paleosalt carbonates, the South Asian section, specifically the Sewaliks, as well as the Bengal fan. So this is showing data from a paper from Kate and her grad student Leanne Colarusso. It's one of the first papers that came out of Kate's lab at Penn State, and one of the first papers that measured the compound-specific carbon isotopes of alkanes and used them as a proxy to record the expansion of C4 grasses and shifts between C3 and C4 communities. So she measured these compounds in both sections from the paleosols and the Sewaliks, as well as sediments in the Bengal fan. And what she found was that there's this 10 to 12 per mil enrichment that coincides with the expansion found in the paleosalt carbonate values between about 8 to 6 million years ago. And so we actually, wanted to use this context where we already know captures grassland expansion and try to layer a fire story on top of that and test some of these dynamics. The first thing I did was I took sediment samples from the Pakistan Sewaliks, and in fact, some of the very same samples that we had archived that Kate and Leanne originally made those measurements in, and I did pH analysis on those. And so what this results in is records. We now have records of hydrologic change, vegetation change, and fire change from the Pakistan Sewalik sections. And so what we find is that, so this top graph, what I'm showing is the oxygen isotope values from the paleosalt carbonates that were originally part of those classic papers from Jay Quaid and Terry Serling, where enrichments are indicating shifts in changes in aridity or seasonality. The middle record is showing you the carbon isotopic values of the alkanes. And these are some new measurements and also some of those measurements from the original paper. And then this final record is showing you pH concentrations that have been normalized to a plant biomarker. And then in this graph, they're actually normalized to the maximum value because I'm going to plot some additional data on it later. And I just want you to note that that graph is on a logarithmic scale. So what we find ultimately is that while fire input is highly variable in the Sewaliks, which is not unexpected given these are paleosols, it increased by an order of magnitude as grasses expanded. So this seems like good initial evidence that there is something happening with fire at the time of this expansion. But we also wanted to ask if these feedbacks potentially scale up from a local to a subcontinental scale. And to get at that, we measured pHs in the Bengal fan as well. But now I got to return to some of our pH challenges because we came across one of them when we started measuring these compounds in the Bengal fan. And it's the potential for mixed sources in pHs. So these compounds, as I mentioned, are produced from biomass combustion, but they're also produced through the thermal maturation of organic matter and come from petrogenic sources as well. So if you have fossil carbon in your samples, this can actually really interfere with your ability to make paleofire interpretations from the concentrations of these compounds. And this is a really well-known problem, partially because PAHs are actually carcinogenic. They're an anthropogenic pollutant from all of our fossil fuel burning and usage. And so the EPA monitors PAHs as an environmental contaminant. And there's an enormous environmental contaminant literature that is basically revolves around sourcing the anthropogenic pollutant sources of these compounds. And so there's a couple of methods that are commonly used, including ordination methods like PCA, but really the most commonly used method to get at these pH sources is this diagnostic ratio method, where you take ratios of PAHs with similar characteristics, you cross-plot them, and then you see where your compounds fall in terms of these diagnostic ratios, right? And so like, you can see the different sources are listed on axes, and you see where your samples are falling, and then you say, okay, well, this looks like it's falling in the fire space, this looks like it's falling in an oil space. But what you can see, even just by looking here, is that the source ratios don't always agree. And they're also really the ranges are really context dependent, and all the ranges in the literature are based on these modern, surface pollutant sourcing that's been done in the environmental contaminant community. So they might not necessarily be appropriate for sourcing them in the neogene, right? But we did use the diagnostic ratio approach in the Sewolics because it's what's commonly used. And what we ultimately found was that the ratios actually gave us a really consistent answer, which was that most of our pHs are pyrogenic. And so we weren't too worried about pH sourcing issues in that context. However, when we got into the Bengal fan, we had a completely different story. So the Bengal fan is looking really petrogenic and mixed, and we were like, oh no, what do we do now? Because we can't just make paleofire interpretations because we know that a lot of these compounds aren't coming from a fire source. And so I actually decided to use another distribution method that's based on another thing that's really well known about pHs and sourcing, and that is that pyrogenically produced pHs have a distinctive alkylation pattern. So alkylation refers to the number of methyl groups that are on the rings. And fossil or petrogenic pHs also have a really distinctive alkylation pattern, and they're very different. So the pyrogenic pattern, the majority of the compounds are unalkylated and progressively less alkylated, while those that are petrogenic have this maximum at like 2 or 3 alkylations. And so we can potentially use this as a way of getting at this sourcing issue, and try to retain all the information that is in these different patterns. And so one method that I came up with to get at this is something I call the alkylated pH derivative index, or APDI. And this basically is like, well, we have this pattern here, we can fit a parabolic curve to these compounds, and then if we take the characteristics of that curve, that'll retain the information about the distributions in a way that gives you a single index value. And so it basically takes the difference between the second derivative, which tells you about the curvature, and the first derivative, which tells you about the direction. And then if you have a distribution that looks like this, you get a positive value. And if you have a distribution that looks like this, you get a negative value. So this is like a way of footprinting these that's a little bit more precise than using those diagnostic ratio crossplots. But it doesn't tell you anything about the relative amount of pyrogenic or petrogenic sources in your samples. And I wanted to do that because I wanted to come up with a way to potentially isolate what proportion of our samples is actually coming from a pyrogenic source. And so I used a method, which is a multivariate method called non-negative matrix factorization, which allows you to take a set of complex samples, extract N members from your samples, and then the method will calculate what proportion of each N member has to go into the complex sample to reconstruct the observed distribution. So this gives you a proportion of each sample. So this is the data from the Bengal fan, of how much of the sample is pyrogenic versus petrogenic. And so then we can use that factor abundance to basically, as a correction factor, to say, well, pH concentration times this proportion is our pyrogenic component. And you can see, right, so these are the reconstructed N members, and those look very much like the data that I showed you on the previous slide, which is coming from like a modern burned experiment pH distribution and pHs that are measured in pools of oil. So it does a really good job. And you can see that both of these methods agree very, very well. It makes sense that they do because they're both using the same type, the same data, these oscillated distributions. But it increases our confidence in our ability to use these methods, potentially pick and choose between them, because they both have advantages and disadvantages, right? APDI is a nice simple index that gives you a positive or negative value. And then the NMF method allows you to quantitatively correct your samples to the pyrogenic or petrogenic distributions. So we applied the NMF correction in the Bengal fan. So now what I'm showing you is ages on the y-axis, the concentrations of pHs that have been corrected for pyrogenic and normalized to plant biomarker are on the x-axis. This is on a logarithmic scale again. And you can see that there are also shifts happening in pH concentrations and abundances through time in the Bengal fan. And so I'm now plotting that data, that new data, on top of our Slowik data, as well as carbon isotope values from leaf waxes measured in the Bengal fan, and hydrogen isotopes of leaf waxes measured in the Bengal fan. And what we see is that there are similar fire, hydroclimate, and grass dynamics occurring at both the local scale as well as the greater subcontinental scale. But I do want to point out there is a really interesting pattern here where there's actually two increases in fire input. There's a 5 times increase initially and then an order of magnitude increase later on, showing that fire increased both before and with the expansion of grasslands. So I'm kind of going to dig into these two different periods briefly to talk about what we think is happening here. So I'm going to talk about this first period, right? We have this increase in fire, an increase in, keep losing my cursor. Increase in fire and a shift in a small shift in hydrology, but no change in the isotopic values of vegetation yet. So this, if anyone attended Pradip Polazar's talk last month, I know that he talked about these results because we collaborated on this work. But basically, just to recap, what we found is that during this period pre-grass expansion between 8 to 10 million years, there's evidence for this intermittent drying. We've got a couple of these enriched samples in both the oxygen and hydrogen isotope records, which corresponds to that initial increase in fire. So we think that what's potentially happening is there's intermittent drying, which is increasing fire, and potentially it's starting to open these landscapes. And there's good evidence from macro and microfossil records in the Nepalese Sewaliks that indicates there's starting to be a shift in vegetation, though still C3 vegetation. There's a little bit of an increase in pollen, but there's an increase in deciduous or seasonal taxa as well. So there's potentially still more work to do in this like pre-C4 expansion phase to better characterize the vegetation and how it's shifting. But we do think there's a little bit of an initial opening that's coming in before C4 grasses fully take over. And so what we do see then is when you do start to get the expansion of C4 grasses, we have this big order of magnitude shift in the fire activity, and then this fully realized shift in the hydrology where you're getting these more arid, seasonally arid systems. So this really does support, right, this idea of these fire feedbacks facilitating grassland expansion, at least in the South Asian context. But as I mentioned before, there's two parts of these feedbacks, right? There's the initial opening feedback, which I just described, but then there's also this maintenance feedback where C4 grasses themselves promote fire. So one way to try to get at and test that feedback is to potentially try to use a proxy to measure where your fuels are actually coming from. And this now gets us into thinking about the compound-specific carbon isotope values of pHs and what is actually affecting those. So to get at this, we did some modern experiments. We basically burned some plants, and we took the burn products, the chars that were left behind after those burns. We extracted the pHs from them, and we made compound-specific carbon isotope measurements. And this was work that was done in collaboration with Clitty Grice and her lab at Curtin University of Perth. And so then what we did is we made those measurements in about 10 to 12 different species of plants. I took the only two other studies that have made compound-specific isotope measurements on single plant burns. And I plotted all of this data in histogram form between taxa that use the C3 photosynthetic pathway and use the C4 photosynthetic pathway. And what you can see is that 10 to 12 per mil split in isotope space that is present in leaf boxes and bulk material is also present in pHs. So they do retain this distinction between C3 and C4 fuels, which means that this is potentially a really useful way, not just getting at what proportion of C3 and C4 grasses are on the landscape, but what proportion of C3 or C4 fuels is actually burning at the time. So we were able to make these measurements on a couple of samples from the Bengal fan. These were selected because they were really pyrogenic when we did that sourcing, and they had enough material for us to actually make the measurements, which is also sometimes an issue here. But for what the samples that we were able to measure, what we see is that one, they fall into the range of modern plant burning values for pHs, but also you can see that there is definitely a distinction and a shift from older samples looking more C3 to the younger samples looking more C4. And when I plot that over time with age on the y-axis again, so this is the pH concentration record I showed before, the leaf wax carbon isotope record I showed before, and then the compound-specific carbon isotopes of different pHs. You can see that there is this isotopic enrichment that occurs during grassland expansion that indicates that not just were C4 grass expanding, not just was fire increasing, but these grasses were actually preferentially burning. And you can see that they actually track the values of this longer chain C35 alkane better than the C31 alkane, and C35 is thought to maybe preferentially capture grass inputs on the landscape. So this is nice evidence for that second part of the fire feedbacks. So to conclude the first part of the talk, what we find ultimately is that fire feedbacks and the burning of C4 grasses facilitate the opening of landscapes in South Asia. From our proxy development and better interpretation perspective, we find that alkylated phenanthrene metrics allow pyrogenic attribution of pHs and improve confidence in paleofire interpretations. This is potentially a very powerful tool. And also that carbon isotopes of pHs can distinguish between C3 and C4 burning. Okay, but the one last challenge that I haven't really talked about yet is uncertainty in the primary controls on the distributions of pyrogenic pHs, because there's potentially a lot of information that's preserved in the distributions of these different compounds. And we are curious about what initial conditions actually impart information to those distributions, and if it's anything we can use to say something about fire in the past. So I did a synthesis of experimentally derived pHs. So basically people that had done burned experiments on single plants, captured the pHs and then measured their distribution. So I took our 12 experiments and I surveyed the literature and added a bunch more. And so we were able to get a literature-derived data set of pH concentrations and distributions, where we also had information about the burn phase that they were measured in. So if they were measured in smoke or charred residues, the plant type they were produced from, so what plant was actually burned, if these reactions were performed under oxygen limited or atmospheric conditions, and the temperature that the burns were conducted at. And so I used a common ordination method, non-metric multidimensional scaling, or NMDS, which is a non-parametric method, to try to understand the variability in the data set, and then which of these external burn conditions might be related to that variability. And so the first thing that we find is that when we look at NMDS1, which represents most of the variability in the data set, we find that pHs are dividing out by size really, really strongly across NMDS1. So the smallest pHs are on the positive side, and the largest ones are on the negative side. And so this means that size controls on pHs are really coming out very strongly in our data set. And so then we can put our external variables on top of that and try to understand what is correlating with these different NMDS axes. And the first thing that immediately jumped out to us is that temperature was not well correlated with pH size. And this was slightly surprising because a lot of studies in literature like to say that pH size is related to fire intensity or burn temperature. And this is basically based on the idea that as you increase your temperature, you actually increase the aromaticity of your burnt pyrogenic carbon, which is something that's been demonstrated in the lab, but mostly in bulk materials, not in these specific compounds. And this principle is sound, but it doesn't seem like it's the correlating well with temperature during these studies. So it was a little bit puzzling to us. But then what we found is that when you code, these are now the sample scores rather than the compound scores, by the phase, the burn phase, if the compounds are measured in smoke or residue, that they start to divide out along NMDS1 a little bit better. So it seems like oxygen limitation and burn phase are the primary controls on pH size distributions. And this actually does make a lot of sense because the size of pHs is related to the physiochemical properties of these compounds. So now I'm showing you the NMDS1 scores plotted against some of these physiochemical characteristics. So The first plot is the optimal water partitioning coefficient, the second is vapor pressure, and the third is solubility. And these different properties actually determine where pH is partitioned out in the environment, how they absorb into the smoke, vapor, particulate phase, or if they absorb to left behind char compounds. And so what it seems to be the case here is that that has a stronger control on pH size variability than temperature. It's not that temperature doesn't have a control, but this is imparting a stronger signal. And so I would just caution you to be cautious about interpreting pH size as a fire intensity proxy without using another line of evidence. And there's actually some really nice work that's been done looking at differences between not just pHs, but other molecular fire compound classes. There's a method called the BCPA method, which breaks down pyrogenic carbon and has shown good correlations with temperature and fire intensity. So there's other methods you can use. And so if you use those alongside pHs, great. But alone, I'm a little cautious about making this interpretation. So I'm not going to be showing you any pH fire intensity stuff during this talk at all. But there's another, axis of variability here, and that's on TS2. What we found is that this compound retine is falling out really strongly on the negative side of NMDS2. And this also makes a lot of sense because retine is a compound that actually is a derivative of abiotic acid, which is found in conifer resin. And so when we plant our sample scores now out by plant functional type, what we find is that a lot of these woody gymnosperm samples are plotting out on NMDS2, and they're really dominated by this retine compound, which, like I said, is something we've observed that it's correlated to conifer inputs, but it's really nice confirmation that, that this is actually a really strong signal across all plant types. So we came up with a ratio to distinguish between angiosperm and gymnosperm burning that I call the ret to 3 ring ratio. So it's retine over the sum of retine and the two other pHs that are the same size as retine, right? So have those similar properties. And what you can see is that angiosperms have really low ret to 3 ring values, generally below 0.2, while gymnosperms have a wide spread, but a lot of them are quite high. And so this is potentially a secondary way to get at some plant fuel sourcing without having to use an isotopic method. It doesn't tell you anything about pathways specifically, but it does tell you something about angiosperm versus gymnosperm. Okay, so now I'm going to jump into the second vignette talking about fire during the African humid period. And the main question I'm going to be addressing here is does savanna fire response to hydroclimate shifts depend on initial rainfall conditions at a site? And the reason that I ask this question is because today savannas and subtropical grassland systems are actually distributed along a large rainfall gradient. And so the dynamics are not actually as straightforward as we would see. So you can see this gradient represented here from about 200 all the way up to 2,000 millimeters of rainfall a year. And so on the arid side of that gradient, the dynamics in savanna systems are mainly fuel driven. So fire is mainly driven by how much fuel is available to burn, and it's limited by fuel. So we know that in these systems, the probability of fire is actually really well correlated with grass biomass, right? So the amount of grass biomass is going to determine if you're able to burn. And the amount of grass biomass in these systems is strongly controlled by the amount of annual rainfall. So that means if rainfall goes up, you have more grass biomass, and in these arid systems where we're fuel limited, that means you might have more fire. And this plays out really nicely on a spatial scale as well. So this is some nice results from a study by Alvarado et al. That looked at correlations between annual burned area and the previous year's annual rainfall across subtropical Africa. And these are all the sites that had positive correlations between rainfall and fire, indicating that they're fuel load limited. But the story actually changes as you move further along that rainfall gradient into mesic savannas. So instead, these systems already have a lot of grass biomass. That's no longer the issue. What becomes the limiting factor is how wet or dry that biomass is, and if it can actually ignite and fire can actually spread through the system during the dry season. So this is basically governed by the idea that fire spread is also related to fuel moisture and negatively correlated to fuel moisture. So the drier your fuel, the more fire is going to be able to spread across the landscape. And this, you can see that this can be related into the way we think about seasonality or the rainfall during the dry season, where if you're in a wetter system and you have a drier or longer dry season, you have an increase in fire because you're able to cure your fuels more. So basically, fire is negatively correlated to dry season rainfall or positively correlated to seasonality in these more mesic systems. And this also plays out at a very broad spatial scale. These are all of the sites across subtropical Africa today that have negative correlations between fire and annual rainfall, indicating these sites are fuel moisture limited. So we get both, right? Just depending on what the rainfall is like. And this plays out super nicely. So this is synthesizing all those spatial results, and now it's plotting the correlation coefficients from all of those sites across the mean annual rainfall of the sites. And what you can see is that all these positive correlations are happening at the arid sites, and we transition into having negative correlations across the mesic sites. So these fuel dynamics are really different depending on what the initial starting conditions are at your site. And to complicate that even further, that once you start to get into these mesic sites, you're entering this bistable savanna forest region, where if you have fire burning in a seasonal environment, first, if fire is completely excluded, you can transition into a stable tropical forest. And so there's also some vegetation dynamics that are in play and related to fire as well. So ultimately, right, we have to ask the question, do fire responses to a similar hydrologic shift or forcing vary depending on the initial conditions of where you started the site? Like you can imagine that if you have an increase in rainfall at a site that's sitting here versus sitting here versus sitting here, that's going to actually look really different in fire space. So this is something that, you know, we need a longer time scale to test than an annual spatial scale or a decadal scale, even from remote sensing data. And so a great way to do that is to jump into the paleo record and look at a time period where we know there was a large change in rainfall and try to analyze what's happening across different sites. And so we went to the African humid period, which was between 14.7 to 5.5 thousand years ago. So just a heads up, I'm jumping from million-year timescales in the Neogene to 1,000-year timescales in the Holocene. So this is a much different timescale than the previous work that I showed you. But basically, across subtropical Africa, in response to changes in insolation, there was a large increase in rainfall. And this has been observed empirically across hundreds of sites across subtropical Africa. So this is a really widespread hydrologic shift. And there are some complications in spatial variability, but ultimately, this is potentially a really good way to test how sites respond to similar forcing. And it's widely interpreted either as an increase in overall rainfall or an increase in dry season rainfall and a decrease in seasonality. And I'll touch back a bit on that later. So to get at this question, we took records from two different lakes in East Africa, Lake Turkana in Kenya and Lake Victoria. And we wanted to test fire responses between these two lakes. And you can see, right, that they sit, one of them sits on the more arid side of this gradient and one sits on the more mesic side. So it's allowing us to kind of distinguish between these dynamics. And lakes that we would project have very different fuel dynamics. And the reason we chose these sites specifically is we already have great hydrogen isotope records from leaf waxes at these sites. So we're able to replicate our efforts. I was able to take the extracts, measure pHs, and then when we already know that the AHP is captured in these contexts. And so we know that both sites experienced an increase in rainfall amount over the AHP. We can make some predictions of what we'd expect to happen across both of these sites based on what we know about their hydrology. And so at Turkana, which is our more arid site, there are two competing hypotheses for the dynamics we might expect to see. The first is we might expect fire activity to increase with increasing rainfall amount over the HP, indicating the site is fuel load limited and remains fuel load limited. Another possibility is that it could actually flip over this threshold from being a fuel load limited site to fuel moisture limited site, which in that case, you would see an increase in fire at the beginning of the event and then a decrease at the end of the event where fire is excluded and those dynamics flip. At Victoria, which is our more mesic site, we expect the dynamics to be more fuel moisture limited, which means we would expect fire to potentially decrease with increasing rainfall at the site. And because it's in this bistable region, there is also a possibility where if fire is excluded completely, then we might actually get the site transitioning from a savanna state to a forest state. So that's another possibility for a site that sits at this rainfall. So using pHs, so we want to do our sourcing metrics. So these are the NMF results from both of these lakes, where we've got pyrogenic and heterogenic end members, but you'll notice that Turkana actually has this third end member that comes out, where it's got this big peak in dimethylated phenanthrenes. And I've done a lot of work with plant burning experiments, so I really recognized what that distribution looks like, and it actually looks really similar to Phenanthrene distributions from specifically conifers and gymnosperms, which have a lot of dimethylated phenanthrenes. And dimethylated phenanthrenes actually are also products of a lot of those resins and those resinous compounds that come from these plants. And so they have this unique large amount of these dimethylated compounds, which are products of resin burning. And so it seems like we have this distal gymnosperm source at the site. And we can actually confirm that by plotting the abundance of that factor against the Rect-T to 3-ring ratio, and we'll see that both those are really well correlated in this record. So there's this other source of pHs besides just pyrogenic, petrogenic at the site that would have potentially interfered with our interpretation of savanna fires. But the good news is because we did the MMF method, we can correct it by that pyrogenic factor, and we don't have to worry as much about how this might obscure our interpretation. So there's another bit of fuel load dynamics to think about at the site. And I mentioned earlier for our Bengal fan and swallow samples that a lot of times we will normalize our pHs to a plant biomarker. This accounts for shifts in fuel load and production, but also shifts in preservation. But we couldn't really do that here, right? Because we're asking questions about shifts in fuel load and fuel moisture. And so making a normalization like this would actually obscure dynamics. But what we can do is we can analyze how these plant biomarkers shift in relation to the pHs themselves. And what we find is that they actually have very different relationships at the two lakes. At Turkana, there's a really strong correlation between this angiosperm biomarker and pH concentrations, while there really isn't a strong relationship at Lake Victoria. And this also is extremely consistent with what we had expected these lakes, because we expect Turkana to be limited by fuel loads and to be fire to be really controlled by fuel loads. While at Victoria, which is a lot wetter, we expect it to be more limited by moisture. And so this is actually helps do a double check of if these fuel moisture dynamics are consistent with what we know about the sites. Okay, so now I'm going to get into some of that pH concentration data. And so what I'm showing you here is on the bottom in the blue are the hydrogen isotopes from leaf waxes from the two lakes. These axes are flipped so that you have increase in rainfall correlating with the negative isotopic values. And then these are the fluxes of pHs into the lakes. The gray bar is indicating the AHP in both of the records. And so what you notice is that the pH flux patterns are actually very different between the lakes. At Turkana, we have this increase in fire activity during the AHP. And at Victoria, we actually have a progressive decrease in fire activity during the AHP. And what we're finding is that, so basically this is a flux, and as I mentioned, we sometimes normalize pHs to biomarker. And so I wanted to do a double check and make sure that these patterns weren't just the result of preservational issues in the records, because we do know a lot is changing at this time. So both lakes have previously published TOC records. And so I took those TOC records and I normalized the pHs to the TOC just to do a double check and see if these same patterns persist. And they do, they're a little bit slightly different. There's still an increase in pHs over the AHP at Turkana, though it's slightly muted. And then at Victoria, there's still a decrease in pHs over the course of the AHP. So what this helps do is make us feel a little bit more confident in our interpretation of these pH fluxes as a paleo fire signal and not just a result of preservational changes over this time. Okay, so what does this mean? So our data at Turkana supports our first hypothesis, right? That fire activity will increase with increasing rainfall, which is really ultimately indicating that fire regimes at Turkana are fuel load limited during this time. At Victoria, we see a different story. So we actually see evidence that fire activity at Victoria decreases with increased rainfall and is in fact almost excluded by the time that you get through the AHP. And we have actually additional pollen evidence that indicates that Victoria actually experienced a vegetation transition as well, where there was this increase in moist forest taxa at the expense of grass pollen in the record. And so this, together with the fire evidence, actually creates this story that fire regimes at Victoria were fuel moisture limited, but then this excluded fires so much that forest was able to increase at the expanse of grasses. So we're actually getting a stable state transition happening here. I also want to point out briefly that the cool thing about this is that these dynamics are actually also really consistent with the interpretation of the AHP in East Africa as an event where seasonality is reduced rather than overall rainfall is increased, because the seasonality in these moisture limited systems is really absolutely critical to having enough time to cure your fuels. So if you shorten the dry season or increase rainfall during the dry season, you are more likely to flip yourself into a stable forest state. And so this has been proposed by modeling work from Jess Tierney, as well as some oxygen isotope work from mammalian teeth in Ethiopia. So I would say that our Victoria results in the fire dynamics are at least more consistent with this hydrologic interpretation than just an overall increase in rainfall, though that might not necessarily be the case of every site. And speaking of every site, as I mentioned earlier, the AHP has been recorded across hundreds of sites across subtropical Africa. So I wanted to take the two sites that we had generated new data from and try to place them into the greater context of what's happening across the rainfall gradient. So I went through the literature and I was really only able to find 4 other sites that had measured fire activity during the HP alongside a hydrologic proxy of hydrogen isotopes and leaf waxes to get at these dynamics. And so we end up with 6 sites. They are distributed nicely across the rainfall gradient with 3 more arid sites and 2 more mesic sites. And so I took that previously published data alongside our data, and actually together creates a really nice picture of not just how fire is responding to rainfall through time, but also through this rainfall space as well. Okay, so now I'm going to show you the different sites across this rainfall gradient. And what I'm showing you here is the blue is once again indicating hydrogen isotope records from each of the lake sites. And then this red is basically fire activity for different proxies that's been normalized to Z-scores. So some of them record fire with charcoal, other organics, or are armored with PAHs. So this is a way of kind of looking at it on the same scale. And so what you'll notice is that in all of these arid sites, they display this distinctive fuel load limited pattern, where you get an increase and decrease in fire activity that tracks rainfall during the AHP. And you'll notice that the magnitude of that change is progressively less as you move from your most arid site to your least arid site, in at least the arid range. The next site is Lake Tanganyika, which actually displays potentially a transition from a fuel load limited to a fuel moisture limited fire regime, because at Turkana, there's an initial increase in fire activity at the very start of the HP that then fully drops off by the end of the event, towards the maximum of the event. So this does fit our predicted hypothesis of what we would expect to see in a record that's actually transitioning from one type of fire regime to the other. And then our 2 most humid sites both display this fuel moisture limited pattern, but they also display transitions to forest stable states. So both of them have drops in fire activity, and then basically fire activity bottoms out during AHP. And both of these sites have a pollen record. So this is Victoria, which has a pollen record. And then this is Lake Batsamwi in Ghana, which has a carbon isotope record of leaf waxes, which indicates a transition from a C4 dominated system to a C3 dominated system, which was interpreted as a transition into a forested state. So both of these are making that stable state transition from a savanna biome to a forest biome. And I just want to put the importance of examining these fire patterns across the AHP into context, because this is an ensemble mean model of annual rainfall predictions across the subtropics in response to anthropogenic climate change. And so this is showing you an ensemble for the RCP 8.5 scenario. And you'll notice that in Africa, in subtropical Africa, and specifically Eastern Africa, we're projected to experience very large increases in rainfall. And so this incorporating these results and how they might potentially influence fire activity is going to be absolutely central for constraining how subtropical grassland fire activity is going to respond to climate shifts in the future. And so the AHP gives us some really important insights. The fact that we need to be considering a lot of this initial variability when we're making our projections in these models. So I want to wrap up this portion of the talk by reiterating that we found during the AHP, savanna fire response to rainfall shifts differed in a predictable way, depending on where a site sat on the rainfall gradient. So these initial conditions are actually really important to projecting how fires in response to a hydrologic shift. And then also on the proxy side, I do want to point out that plant-derived functional pHs can help us distinguish between vegetation sources and fuel dynamics in a way that is potentially really useful, especially when you're talking about the nuanced fuel dynamics of these fire regimes. So I want to end the talk by just kind of recapping some of the proxy-oriented stuff, because, you know, this is one thing that, like, Kate's work has really pushed the envelope on how we think about paleo proxies. And it's something I learned in her lab, and I continue to be very interested in my own work. So what we found is that we've done a better job at better interpreting pHs. We found out a lot. We can quantitatively correct for source. So for burn biomass for fossil carbon fuels, we can measure the carbon isotopes of PAHs to try to get at C3 per C4 burning. Functional PAHs can help us understand fuel dynamics, and then pH size distributions seem to be linked to phase partitioning strongly. So this is definitely progress, but we actually still have a long way to go on our curve of proxy certainty. And so I think there's a lot of a rich opportunity for additional work to better calibrate this proxy. So first of all, we need to continue to measure isotopes from additional diverse plant types, right? Because like I said, there's only 3 studies that have done it. We're still missing a lot of the variability in vegetation. We need to start doing more multi-proxy calibrations, calibrating pHs with charcoal, with bulk black carbon, with other molecular proxies for fire. And some of that work is starting to take off, which is great. And then finally, there's an opportunity in nested scale calibrations, which is where you take a system, you measure it all the way from a source to so if you have a fire, you measure the products of that fire initially, and then you measure the soils that fire burned on, and then you measure a sedimentary record where that fire would have been incorporated, and try to like fully track your proxy from source to sink to constrain other taxonomic and transport issues that might affect your proxy. And that's part of a brand new project that I'm starting this summer for pHs and some other biomarkers in Kruger National Park in South Africa. So I'm really excited to start to optimize these and to optimize them for grassland systems, which is where a lot of my questions are focused. So I want to finish by acknowledging the many co-authors that helped with the work that I presented today, as well as my funding sources. And I do want to finish by giving a big shout out to Kate specifically, who was not only instrumental to a lot of this work, but has been such a great mentor to me, and who's inspired me and lots of other scientists, many of whom have had an opportunity to speak during the seminar series over the course of the last month or two. So thank you guys for being such a great audience. I will take any questions.